Hey everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. This is video 2 of the start of June's food prep, planning and preservation. So we're still using groceries from April, and we're in June, but this is heading into June's of what we've done, and this is more about using up everything that's in the freezers and stuff from that supply run. So this is the second half of what I do. The first half of the month is all about the preserving and prepping for the later on the month, and the last half of the month is all about using the stuff that I preserved and prepped in that first half of the month and making sure that we're still getting well-rounded, wholesome meals, tasty, filling and enjoyable meals, even though I haven't been to the grocery store for 6-7 weeks. So that's why we share, because everyone's always interested in it, but also because it sort of motivates me a little bit sometimes too, to make food that is interesting. I like interesting food, but I also don't have a huge appetite. So at times I can cook something for everyone else for dinner and just go, I'll have coffee, I'm all good. So this pushes me a little bit to make things interesting and enjoyable and full and filling for everyone to eat, so that I can share it as well and show how we're using things. But I also like to make sure that I use everything that's in my fridge and freezer before I go on the next supply run. Not everything. There's always stuff left in the freezer, and I'll share that before when I do my planning video. Our fridges are pretty empty at the moment though. Nearly everything is straight off the shelf or out of the freezer, or pantry stuff, but I will share that when I do the planning. But at the moment it's about going through and making sure that the stuff that needs to be used is used, and I'm not doubling up on purchasing more this month if I haven't used it from the previous month. So this is another couple of days in my kitchen, using up what we have and making sure that everything gets used in an appropriate manner, and sharing how we do it. So a couple of times within each supply run period, so every couple of months, I like to go through my freezers and pull out any veggies that are that have been frozen and are well beyond using, or carcasses that we've frozen, like if we've roasted whole chickens and things like that, or if we had a lot of chicken legs this month, so I get all the legs put into bags to go into the freezer to use as well. So we keep all of those ends of celery bunches, all that sort of thing. So any shredded carrot, the carrots have gone bad, we'll shred some carrots to stick them in the freezer, anything like that. I like to go through the freezers and clean that out and make sure that we're making plenty of space for when I bring the next lot home. So this particular day I had some chicken legs, which with the way they're cooked, they're marinated and then they're cooked in the barbecue, they always add some really lovely flavour to the stock. There were some whole carcasses in there, some very sad looking celery. I added a bit of garlic, and I found a bag which was probably the bottom out of a pressure cooked whole chook with the bones in it. So someone must have just tipped the whole bottom of the pressure cooker into a bag and frozen it rather than straining that stock off separately. So it's stock, basically stock with all the bones frozen in it. I filled up the pot with water. There's lots of bones in here and lots of flavour, so I'm going to do a big batch. I've got none on the shelf left at the moment at all, which is why I've been using the Vegeta so much lately. I've got my big stainless steel buffalo pot, which I think is 30 litres, that I'm going to pressure cook it in. So I fill it up to sort of the max line with all those bones. I got it going and I pressure cook my stock for 90 minutes on the stovetop. So I wait till it is blowing a steady stream of steam, and then I put the weight on it and I bring it up to pressure and I time it for 90 minutes. After the 90 minutes, the pressure drops naturally and the stock is somewhat handleable. I start straining it and filling jars. I have these lovely wide mouth quart jars from Susan. I love using these for stock. I do use them a lot for storage, etc. as well, because they're really easy to get all those different use plastic lids for, with all those different purposes. One of the wonderful things about ball mason jars is that everyone makes all the extras that fit them, unlike a lot of standard jars, and I really enjoy having these lovely wide mouth quart jars full of dry products with matching lids and stuff like that. I know, a bit silly, but anyway. I tend to strain it into a bowl. I just use a colander, so my stock definitely isn't as clear as it could be. If you want a really nice clear stock, then you need to be aware of what vegetables you put in it for a start. Certain vegetables will create more cloudiness. Zucchini, sweet potato, all that sort of thing will create a lot of cloudiness in your stock. But you also need to refrigerate it. So you need to strain it, refrigerate it, and then once all the little excess bits and pieces have settled to the bottom and the fat has risen to the top, the fat will solidify. You scrape the fat off and you pour the stock out without all those bits in the bottom. You leave them behind and then bring it back up to temp before canning it. For me, fat and those little bits just add to the flavour, and I'm not concerned. As I said, certain vegetables will also make it more cloudy, so it depends on what I'm using it for sometimes too, as to what veggies I put in it and what needs using. My Presto will hold 7 quart jars, so I filled 7 jars up with the stock. I cleaned the rims really well with vinegar. I left a generous 1.5-inch headspace because I did not skim the fat off it, so there is some fat in the stock as well, and you don't want that to bubble up and interfere with your seal. I put it into the canner. I put 3 quarts of hot water in the bottom of the canner with these jars because the jars are hot, so we want the water that they're going into to be hot as well, because if you have cold water and you put hot jars in there, you can risk thermal shock and you can crack your jars. Then I turn the pressure canner on. It will do a steady stream of steam for 10 minutes. Then I will put the weight on and I will start my timer for 90 minutes. After 90 minutes under pressure, the carcasses from the chooks are able to be crushed between your fingers. However, some of the bones in this are bones from our roosters that we processed, and obviously their bones are a lot stronger. The chickens are older and they're more virile animals than chickens that you buy from a supermarket, and they did not get soft enough to crush. So when we puree this up for dog food, which is what we do, we removed any of the large rooster bones out of it because I didn't want to risk damaging my Thermomix with the bones that were harder than normal. It may have been able to tolerate it, but I didn't want to risk that. So we puree all the veggies. We pull the garlic, the majority of the garlic and onion out that are in there, and then we puree it all up into a paste, and the dogs get this with their dry food as dog food. So those bones just all go into a paste. But if we just had to pull those rooster bones out to do that. I also filled a Dutch oven with about 4 litres of stock. I'm going to slowly reduce this while I'm running the canners and doing other things in the kitchen until it's a very concentrated jelly. Once the canner had that steady stream of 10 minutes, I put the weight on and started the timer for the stock. Being a clear stock with no solids or extremely minimal solids, it only requires 25 minutes of canning time. So once the weight goes on and it comes up to pressure, then I will start the timer for 25 minutes. I kept simmering the other stock throughout the afternoon and until it had reduced considerably. I turned it off once I needed the burners for making dinner, and it was probably about a quarter of what it had started with, maybe a bit less, maybe a fifth of what I had started with. I had also kept a container of stock aside for dinner, so I made the Quirky cooking chicken and brown rice soup. This recipe is made for the Thermomix and it works wonderfully in there because it stirs the whole time it's cooking, but 1 jugful is not nearly enough for all of us, so I'm making it on the stove instead. Being a dairy-free soup, the way that Joe gets it to a nice thick consistency is by grinding up some of the brown rice into a flour as well as some almonds. Now I had this almond flour and no raw almonds left, so I used that and the brown rice. I powdered the brown rice first and then added the almond flour and mixed it up, put it in a bowl and set it aside for later on. I used my Thermomix to cut up the garlic and carrots. We bought the carrots in town because we didn't have any left, and cooked them off in a little oil. I also added some caramelized onion off the shelf and a big bag of zucchini from the freezer, which is not in the recipe, but I love adding zucchini into soups and I add it into a lot of things, and that's why I keep it frozen in the freezer. I put a lid on that and turned it down so that the zucchini would defrost and let out some juices. Once that was done, I added some chicken pieces into the mix and topped it right up with stock from the stock I had just made. I added whole brown rice as well as the ground up brown rice and the almond flour. Now, this is the only tricky part of doing this recipe on the stove. Once those flours have been added, you need to keep the soup agitated or it will burn to the bottom because it tends to settle to the bottom where it's hot. And you need to cook it long enough that the whole brown rice cooks through. So you're sort of looking at least 30 minutes. So you need to be nearby and stirring and scraping the bottom for that 30 minutes. It's worth it. It's a really nice soup, but there is that hands-on aspect to it. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get a very appetizing shot of this soup once it was done, but you can see the texture of it when you scoop up the solids. That brown rice and chicken and veg all ends up being this super thick and hearty soup. It's super filling and it reheats really well. This is what the stock concentrate looks like after it has chilled. It's a gelatinous mix of super concentrated stock with a little fat on top. There's a few choices you can do with this at this point. You could skim the fat off and spread the rest onto racks and dehydrate it, and then you have stock powder, or you can freeze it. Now, it takes a lot of hours to dehydrate, and I just do not have that kind of power available to run my dehydrator at the moment, so I chose to freeze it. That way I can use it for those dishes where you want the stock flavor, but not the abundance of liquid that comes with using like a whole jar of stock. I didn't scrape the fat because fat is flavour and I'm not dehydrating it, I'm freezing it. So I just scraped it all into one of the ice trays that was sent to me. I am loving these, and I know they ended up expensive here in Australia. I put a link to them in the last video where I showed them, but I think they're kind of worth it. They are just such a good structural ice tray, and the lids clip on, and I'm really enjoying using them. I filled just one tray, so remember this was 4 litres of stock initially, and then popped it into the freezer to use in other cooking throughout the next week until I make more. Next month, you know, until next, and however long it takes me to use it. So we had brown rice soup for lunch the next day, and I used the lack of needing to cook lunch to get into making our bulk bolognese with that beef trim. I started off by making another batch of my test run to French bread. I think it might be the next video where I was finally super happy with it and comfortable showing the whole process and sharing the recipe. So I think that's the next video. I used my DIY setup proofing box to proof that dough a little quicker than if it was just on the bench. And I also use warm water when I make the dough just to give it a little bit of a kickstart as well. Once proofed, I shaped and used the baguette trays and put it back in the proofer for a second lot of proofing. I then minced up all the beef that I had put aside to turn into mince. I used my Louvel mincer. I'm forever extolling its virtues. It is a great workhorse mincer with a relatively low power draw, and I really love it. There is an affiliate code in the description if you are interested. It minces about 1 kilo per minute, and I've not had any issues with it overheating, even when doing things that Louvel doesn't recommend, like large quantities of lard. And it's a good being on the bench, because I used to use the KitchenAid mincer, and because the KitchenAid mincer was so high, the reaching up to put beef in it caused a lot of problems with my shoulders and my hands, whereas this is on the bench, which is nice and low. It doesn't take much pressure to push the meat through either. It tends to just feed itself, and I did have issues with the KitchenAid overheating as well. So I am grateful that I went with this one, and I've really enjoyed it. And there was no sponsored post for anything for this one. I chose this one after doing some research, and I'm so happy with it that I'm recommending it. I scored the French bread when they'd proofed in the middle of the mincing as well to get that into the oven. As I filled the bowl with mince, I put in some vacuum seal bags to freeze as well. I only want to turn about half of this into bolognese right at the moment, so I put I think it was 3 1-kilo bags in vacuum seal bags to go in the freezer, and I think I put a couple of kilos in a Ziploc bag to use for hamburgers the next night, and then the rest was used for the bolognese. So I got started on the bolognese. I used my Thermomix to mince up carrots, celery, dried mushrooms, and got that started in the pot with a little oil. I added a bag of the onions that I had in the freezer from the hamper, and a bag of frozen zucchini as well. I put the lid on that to let it all defrost, and once defrosted, let some of the liquid off as well. Once defrosted, let some of the liquid cook off as well. I then added the beef to the veg and broke it all up and cooked until browned. I added a couple of the 800-gram tins of crushed tomatoes, a couple of jars of passata, then using some water in the jars to get the excess liquid out as well. I added a jar of tomato paste. I mixed that up and let it simmer for a bit so I could assess the liquid volume. Once it had simmered for a while, I added what I had left of a jar of yellow lentils, or dal, we use this for dal mostly, some vegeta and some Worcestershire sauce, and stirred it up and dropped it down to a simmer again. I need to get those lentils nice and soft. Now, realistically, I should have soaked these before using them. They tend not to cook as well in the acidic tomato environment I'm putting them in, and they stay with a little bit of a firm texture. Some of the kids aren't super fond of that slightly firmer texture, but they deal with it. I actually prefer pearl barley in there, but I don't have any of that at the moment either, and it is another carb, whereas the lentils are adding protein, so there's sort of pros and cons to both. But the texture of the pearl barley is amazing, and has this like nuttiness to it that complements it, and it tastes, I don't know, I prefer pearl barley, but it is another carb, whereas the lentils are protein. So the lentils are probably more nutritionally rounded. This is what the next batch of bread came out of the oven looking like. As I said, I think this is the last test batch I make, and the next time I film the whole process and share the recipe and stuff. I like to simmer my bolognese for a few hours, which is partly why I make such large batches. I want those lentils to break down a little, but I also want the flavours to get nice and rich, some of that water to cook off, and the fats and the tomatoes to make themselves well known. If I need more liquid, I add a bit of stock, sometimes add a bit more salt. Balsamic vinegar is quite often added to achieve that little bit of acidity, but the sweetness as well. It depends on the veggies you've added and how much tomato product as well that you've needed to make it work. I really like mincing bacon up in the Thermomix and cooking it off with the liquid and with the veggies and stuff initially too, but I didn't have any bacon left this month either. I generally cook it all afternoon and then put the lid on it and put it in the fridge because it's much easier to bag up for the freezer when it's cold, and you can't use the chamber vacuum sealer if it's hot either. Bolognese is one of our like standard things to have in the freezer. I nearly always have at least half a dozen servings of bolognese in the freezer. Now, I used to bag it up in 1.2 kilo lots, and that was enough for the kids if Darryl and I weren't eating it, and there were some bigger bags if Darryl and I were eating as well. But 1.2 kilos, and then on the shelf I have some jars of pasta sauce that I've canned. I call it pasta sauce. It's basically just vegetables. Like it's tomato based, but there's normally zucchini and mushroom and carrots and all sorts of things in there. So it's just a garden tomato sauce that I use. So we normally put the 1.2 kilos of bolognese and then the jar of pasta sauce in there as well, and that's enough to feed everyone. So I keep my bolognese nice and thick, and then I freeze, because it's easier to freeze if it's nice and thick than if it's got too much liquid in it, and then add that vegetable pasta sauce with it as well. We did freeze it in 2 kilo lots this time because the 1.2 kilo lots are not stretching far enough, and Darryl and I have been eating it as a meal with them lately as well. We used to use it as a little bit of a kids fend them for themselves meal. Like Surreal could easily make bolognese for the kids and Darryl and I would have something else or whatever. But in winter we tend to all eat exactly the same thing because we're cooking early. I don't have time to make multiple meals, so we're more inclined to eat it all at the same time. So we froze in 2 kilo lots this time to see if that's enough, and that's 2 kilos with the beef and lentils and everything else in it. And then we put a jar or two of the pasta sauce on as well. I will have to make that pasta sauce again soon. I think there's only 4 or 5 jars on the shelf, but because we're doing it at that higher quantity. Now, this was only like 4 kilos of beef mince that went into it, and then everything else was veggies and lentils and things like that. I think we got four bags of 2 kilos out of it, so we got double the amount of the mince plus a meal, as from what I can remember. I'm pretty sure we had it for dinner, and then we also had the 4 bags frozen. So, the extra veggies and the sauces and lentils and everything double that mince quantity, the weight of it in the meals, and we might have got 4, but that's still not very many. Like, even if we only eat that once a week, that's only 4 weeks, and I only shop every 8 to 9. So, as I said, I will be buying more beef trim this month. I did put mince in the freezer as well, and sometimes I make things like pasticcio and things like that with the mince, which is sort of a bolognese dish as well, but slightly different because it's layered, or lasagna or something like that. And I don't always use the bolognese that I've made. I'll make a new sort of a version of it for those dishes. So some of that mince will still be turned into similar things to bolognese, but yeah, I definitely will get another box of trim this month because that is only a few serves of bolognese in the freezer, and it's such an easy meal to make, and so it's so well-rounded nutritionally with all the veggies and everything in it as well. So I normally like to have half a dozen to a dozen of them in the freezer at any one time, so I will do that again. And everyone loves it. Kids love it. I also use it sometimes to put on loaded potatoes, or sometimes with corn chips and stuff. I suppose I used it a little bit like an American chili, except we don't have beans in it. But sometimes we have it with corn chips, a bit like a nacho type dish with the bolognese instead and things like that. So anyway, that was the next couple of days in my kitchen, and I hope you enjoyed watching, and I will see you again on the next video. Bye guys.